Today we're talking about search parameters. We're going to touch on when to use them and when not to use them. And I'm going to show you how to implement this in the right way in Next.js with multiple search parameters, both on the server and on the client. What we're looking at here then is we've got our domain name, query parameters, search parameters, however you want to refer to them. They always start with a question mark followed by the first parameter. So in this example, we've got an ID of 1, and then any additional parameters we prefix with an ampersand, so include equals y. So really straightforward. One of the benefits of doing this is that you're essentially managing state within your URL, and essentially in order to change state, you just navigate to a different URL. So let's talk a little bit about when we should be using this and when we shouldn't. So some good examples of when to use it. So if you are fetching data based on that state, you can use a query parameter. Page numbers, again, for pagination. If you're using something like Next.js, if you don't need to, let's say, statically generate out your pages, and to do that, you would of course just use a regular parameter. If you don't care about doing that, you can manage your page number for pagination, your start, offset, things like that. You can do all of that in your query state really easily. If we've got a search on our site and we're submitting a search and then navigating to a search page, let's say, it makes sense to do that in the query parameters. Similar to filtering, if we have tabs and you control which tab you're on, makes sense to do it in the query parameters. And similarly to modals, if your modal is visible or not. And of course, the benefit of doing that for all of these things is that if your URL is either bookmarked or shared with somebody else, they can get to the exact same place that you were. So really powerful. Just to call out when not to use it, if we're maintaining state just for personalization, so maybe light versus dark mode, something like that, it's not relevant to put it into the URL state. It's just for one user. You don't want anything sensitive in this URL parameters. And if something is just really not important and you don't want it to be included as part of your navigation, don't include it. So let's look at an example. So if I go to Google, you will see some URL query parameters. So let's say, is React good? So you can see here, we've got google.co.uk/search. That is our domain name. This question Q is plus React plus good. So this is our query on Google. The pluses here standing for spaces. And if I then go to the next page, you will see, and they use a lot of different parameters, don't know what all of them are for, to be completely honest, but we see here and start equals 10. So that is saying fetch results, but start after 10. So a really simple way to do pagination here on these results. As we go through the pages, you can see start equals 30 now because we're on page 4. So hopefully that makes sense. Let's dive into our application and see how we can implement this within Next.js. So I have started a brand new Next.js project and open it up in VS Code. And then I'm just going to run the development server here. And let's open up our localhost 3000. So we've got the default starter page, no problem. Let's just do a couple of things. So I'm just going to clear out the home page and let's just hello from home. Let's just do this. So we've got hello from home. Let's just empty out this as well, just so we're good. Awesome. So we've got a starter. Now you can simply do params like this. ID equals 1, and we have a search parameter. So it's not doing anything at the moment. So how do we change that? How do we read this value is the first question. So within our page, now this applies to pages and layouts, but not server components. So within a page, you can pull off search params, and I can say search params is going to have an ID of string. And I'm going to say it can either be a string or undefined. And then I can console log out search params.id. And we can see, if I bring back up the terminal, we have 1. So if I say ID is like so, ID is 1. So really easy to capture the search parameters like this. And then if I just quickly make a different component, I'm going to call it, let's say ID next, with the idea that I'm going to use this to increment the ID. But for now, let's just make this a client component and read the search parameter in here. So of course we don't have access, it's not a page or a layout, but because it's a client component, we do have a hook to read the search parameters. So I can say const search params equals use search params. Let me then import, that's not where I want it from, use search params from next, and it's coming from navigation, like so. And then just to make TypeScript happy, I'm going to put an exclamation mark on here, which means it's not going to return null. So then I can say const ID equals, search params.get, and we pass in the key, let's say. So your search params, if you think of them, you've got a key and a value. In our browser, you can see ID is the key, and then 1 is going to be the value. So if we save this, and then let's pull out another one. So we're going to say project equals search params.get project, and then I can say data data is going to be ID, which is going to be ID or just an empty string. We're going to have project, which is going to be project or an empty string. And then let's just throw this out on the page. So just JSON stringify data undefined 2. So we have our component. This is a client component. We're bringing in 2 parameters now. And if I just include this on the home page, so we say next, was it ID next? Yeah. So if I throw that out, we go back, we can see now we have got an ID of 1 and a project of nothing. So without an ID, obviously it's empty, or I can say project equals 3 and we get a project. And I can say and ID equals 1. And now we get an ID. So really simple to access search parameters, but then how do we navigate in a way that not only sets our new parameter. So if I want to say ID equals 2, when we're editing this in the URL, quite straightforward, project, we don't change it. But when we are dealing with lots of different search parameters, we need to make sure that, okay, we're updating our parameter and then navigating there, let's say, but we're not changing any of the other parameters at the same time. So let's get to our example. So I'm going to pull into the page search params also the include, which is going to be a string or undefined. And then what I'm going to do is, to make this example realistic, to show you how you would really use this in an app, let me create a lib folder and I'm just going to create a data file. So within this data file, what I'm going to do is create a function which is essentially fetching data. So if we export a function, I'm just going to call it fetch data. And of course, that is going to take in ID, which is a string, and also this include, which is a string. We want to, because this is going to be mimicking data fetching, we want to make this a real function, and then, okay, let's not type this. So we're going to return off the back of it our data. We're going to have to return a promise. So let's return a new promise. Resolve, we don't need to reject. For this example, that's fine to a point. Let's bring our data in here. So data is going to be, if we have an ID, we're going to pass it, otherwise empty string. Same for the include. We're going to then send our data, resolve, and then that gets past our data in here. And then where are we at? We need another one of those, I think, and then one of those, yeah. So it takes in an ID and include. Usually you would be going off to a database and making some request here, right? So we are essentially just sending them back with a 1 second delay. So then what we don't want to do is just do it directly on this page ultimately. I want to create a different component. So let's do that. Let's call it data display. Function data display. And one of the reasons for that, I want to wrap this in a suspense boundary. And then, okay, within here, we're going to say data equals await fetch data. And of course, we need the ID and the include, right? So you could do a couple of things here. You could make this a client component, use the hook and pass it in. I don't really want to do that. So let's use our data display here, which we can pass in ID, which is going to be search params ID. We can pass in include, which is going to be search params dot include, right? We've got this here, and then we can bring in those parameters. So ID and include, and those are going to be, yep. So a string or undefined, or a string or undefined. Now our fetch data, it needs to be an async function for this to work. And then fetch data, of course, needs to take in ID and include. So a string or undefined is not assignable to a type of string. So we need to change this string or undefined, string or undefined. And that's one of the quirks, I suppose, of working with the query parameters is that ultimately they could always be undefined because, well, dependent on your page. Yeah, just depending on what's happening. You may have them or you may not. So use search params only in client components. Have I removed that? Use client, yeah. Okay, so we now have okay, data display, but it's not doing anything. So in here, yep, that's what I wanted to do. Let's do that. And then in this ID next, let's stop doing that. And we're going to return a button, which is going to say next project. So let's go back and have a look. So Cool. So let's make that look like an actual button. I know it's not too relevant for this, but px3 py1 border gray 200, that's fine. So we've got a button now on our page. Let's just add a bit of margin on here, and then in the data display, let's again add a bit of margin here as well, so we got some space. And let's just max width 7XL, put some padding and center that a little bit. Okay, so we're gonna be able to move to the next project, and then let's do this one first. So how do we now set the URL parameters? So within client components is where you're generally going to be setting URL parameters, and there's actually an example of how to do this in the docs. So if I grab this function, that's the most useful part of this. So we're in the ID next, and we're going to grab the search params and then the ID search params. We don't need this anymore. Let's pop in this function, and we're going to need to bring in use callback from React. So on this button, what we want to do is on click, we want to do something. And what we're going to do is essentially navigate. And to do that, we're going to use the router. So if we say router equals use router, and you want to bring this in from next navigation again. So router equals use router, and essentially we want to push the query string onto it. And what this function is doing, so it's taking in a name and a value, and what it's doing is it's taking our existing search params and creating a new params. It's then setting the name and value, and then it's returning the params as a string. And then this is relating to the use callback. Don't worry, we will cover that another day. But essentially, the magic here is taking your existing params and then setting the new name and value. And what that does is it maintains all of your existing search parameters, and it just updates the ones you want to update. So what are we doing here? ID next. So I want to say, okay, let next ID equals, okay, so we're gonna pass int, if we've got an ID, or make it 0 and then +1. So that's fine. And then we can push that into the function for create query string. So this router.push, it's a navigation. So we're gonna go to / to the current route. We're gonna put in this question mark. So the query string doesn't contain that first question mark. It does contain the ampersands if you have multiple. So go / question mark, and then we're creating a query string and passing the ID with the next ID to string. Hopefully that makes sense. Let's save this now and see what happens. So we covered the case where we don't have one, so we should see this increment to 1. So we hit next project, ID goes to 1. And that is great. Now we go to 2. One of the things that you might notice is if we refresh this, the suspense is not exactly doing much. So one of the things we can do, so it should work on the initial load, even like this. Let me add a loading.tsx file, And then let's just export a default function loading. And then we're just going to return a div loading ... So then, okay, on the first one we get full loading. Page, we got data display, and yeah, so we want to wrap this. We want to wrap this component here in the suspense boundary. Fallback equals loading, like so. Awesome. So then we have this. And then again, ideally we wouldn't put this. We wouldn't put that margin there because you can see it jumps around. We would wrap this in something and include the margin here so it doesn't jump around on reload. Awesome, so we have our suspense working now. Next project, and it's not working. What we can do is we can pass a key to here, search params ID, and then as we hit next project, that is working as expected. And that is essentially how to manage search parameters. Now, the implementation we just did for this ID next, it works. It doesn't matter how many parameters that you have. So what I would suggest doing is stop the video, go and bring in this include and create a toggle for improve. So whereas in the ID, we say, this is the next ID, we take our current ID plus 1. What you want to say for the include is you would say if include equals yes, then we make it no, otherwise yes. And that will cover the cases for that as well. So go and try and implement include. You would use the exact same logic as this. Go try it, and you've essentially mastered search parameters.